and he's been a public historian for over 18 years in Colorado, Arizona, and Montana, mostly working as an archivist, specializing in government records. He is currently a photographer,
photograph archivist. Two things you don't necessarily put together.
NHS work. He has worked for over 10 years. Jeff earned a master's degree in history from Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado. Please welcome Jeff Malcomson. Thank you. Sorry about
Thank you. Thank you very much. Perfect. Thanks for inviting me to do this, and it's great to have an opportunity to take this presentation I did at the Montana History Conference in Bozeman just a few weeks ago, and get a little more time here, so that's always nice. You only have like 25, 30 minutes to do a presentation at the history conference. So this is, I think I have, 2 hours? Is that right? That's what it'll take, so better get started, huh? I think I need a drink real quick, though. But yeah. Okay. Is that good? Keep an eye on that. Make sure I ration 2 hours. It's got to last. All right, so the topic is homicide in Territorial, Montana. And some people might be going, why? Why are you doing this? I'll get to that, but first I want to just dive into the Montana Territory. The Territory isn't actually founded until 1864, but right from the beginning, one of its preeminent citizens, or one famous early miner, John White, who founded gold at Bannock, he was murdered less than a year after that discovery in Bannock. He and his partner were murdered in what's, I think, present-day Jefferson County. That was so kind of one of the first quote-unquote famous murders in Montana history. Of course, we know about the road agents allegedly killing maybe 100 people when they were also trying to steal their belongings and kind of take what they wanted in the rough and tumble Bannock, Virginia City area and up the trails that led to it. So then, of course, the vigilantes kind of put a stop to that, and they killed about 20-something, maybe 28 individuals over a course of maybe 6 months from 63 to 64. So this is the early stuff that often gets a lot of attention. And one of my reasons for doing this, a little more intensive study and over a longer period of time, is to try to put all that in context, try to tell the larger story, not just get drawn into the vigilante affairs, although that's very difficult to avoid, as you'll see. I want to tell you about at the beginning here, one particular week in December 1866. Turned out to be an extremely violent week in the mining camps of Montana. December 14th, in particular, was a horrible day. Helena, early morning, the body of Louis Truck, who was a German miner, had a claim on Dry Gulch. His body was found on the floor of Carson Brewery. Very suspicious case. The newspaper actually thought at first that it was probably a murder. Later they said that it was probably a suicide. We don't really know. The coroner's inquest came back saying that he was killed by unknown persons. They didn't have any evidence one way or the other, so they ended up saying it was an unknown situation. So I'm counting it as a homicide here. Could be a suicide. As we go through, and as I went through the records and the newspapers, you find a lot of suicides along with homicides. So that's a whole other topic that maybe I'll get into a little bit. But one interesting thing I found in the research. Also in Gallatin Valley that same day, Newton Little tried to break up a fight over a woman between two roughs on a ranch, and he got shot, and he was almost killed. The newspaper thought that he would surely die of his wounds, but he actually ended up recovering. So that is not counted as a homicide, but still happened this day. The big thing that happened was in Cave Gulch, and this is the largest shootout in Montana Territorial history. Leaves 5 dead. There were at least 9 men opened fire on 7 men who were building a cabin on a plot that the 9 men thought was theirs. And they had actually had a case pending, as far as the newspaper said, in the courts. But that morning, December 14th, it came to, as the newspaper said, the 9 men decided to trust in the wisdom of Henry's rifle instead of waiting for the courts to settle it. The men they fired upon were actually in the process of building a cabin on the claim, and it was a little too close to their cabin, about 300 or 400 feet away. They fired from their cabin, from the protection of their cabin, killed 5 men. This is a huge affair. It actually doesn't happen in the counties that I'm particularly studying here. It's just across the river, across the Missouri River. And I don't know if everybody knows where Cave Gulch is roughly. It's roughly where Canyon Ferry is, just one gulch down from Canyon Ferry. And it's on the east side of the Missouri River. And had been a gold discovery earlier that summer in '66 and was populated by quite a few miners at the time. So the men actually were pursued by a posse, or vigilante group from Helena and the surrounding area, came and apprehended these 9 men. They actually apprehended some of the other men that were wounded and shot at, and brought them all back to Helena. The vigilantes did. Decided that they weren't going to kill them, string them up or anything. They turned them over to the civil authorities. The men were guarded very closely and taken to Confederate Gulch, which was the county seat of Marr County where the event happened, and waited for trial. The trial was actually, the venue was changed to Helena, so the trial took place here. It's a big affair. And I'll just go ahead and tell you that the men actually got off. No one was convicted of this crime. Homicide of 9 people in one very 5-minute stretch of gunfire. One I'll give you a little bit more detail about and actually read some of the account from the newspaper. Just about 6 weeks after that, I'm going to go back, as I did. There we are. December 19th, just a few days later, in Gallatin County again, a group of ranchers had had enough of a particular horse thief, cattle thief, and they tracked him down finally. This guy was notorious, and they cornered him in a patch of willow, lit a fire, and he came out and tried to shoot, and they all opened fire on him and killed him. So another example of frontier rough justice. Just a few days after that terrible December 14th. But then 6 weeks later, we have the Hodge-Moore shooting affray. These are typically in the newspaper called shooting affrays for whatever reasons, but let me tell you about this one in some detail, so bear with me here. The usual quiet of that portion of Orofino Gulch, known as Roosevelt, about 4 miles from this city, from Helena, at the point where the National Mining and Exploring Company is located, was rudely broken on last Wednesday morning by one of the most sickening and heartrending shooting affairs that generally falls to the lot of the journalists who chronicle. The affray took place between 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning and resulted in the severe wounding of Professor Hodge, his son, Mr. Russell Hodge, and a man named George Moore. The reception of the news here created a profound sensation among all classes, and our reporter immediately proceeded to the scene of the calamity to glean such facts in regard to the occurrence as would enable us to lay before our readers a statement that could be relied upon. It appears from what he could gather from the various parties that the circumstances of the case are about as follows. Professor Hodge is the agent and general superintendent of the National Mining and Exploring Company of New York, having charge of the company's mill and property situated in Orofino Gulch. And this is a substantial mill that had just opened recently, so this is a pretty respected person among the mining class, among any, that's really all the class that is in Helena at the point. But so it's interesting. This is a superintendent of a mining company, so it's a little. It kind of got everybody's attention more than just kind of a shootout between claimants at a particular claim jumping situation. But so Professor Hodge, having charge of the company's mill and property situated in Orofino and Grizzly Gulches, and as such had bought, shortly after his arrival here, a timber ranch for the purpose of supplying his various works, over which there had been some dispute. and the case was in the courts for adjudication. Again, cases in the courts. Up to the present time, there had been no trouble about the matter, and probably would not but for the hasty action of both parties. What led to the affray, however, was the fact that George Moore, and some others had cut down some trees on what Hodge considered to be his ground, but which the others denied his right to claim under any circumstances. Moore lived in a cabin close by, and the wood had been cut up into lengths preparatory to being either used or hauled away. On the fatal morning, the professor took two or three teams, and accompanied by his son and several others, proceeded to where the wood was and commenced to load up. Either anticipating trouble or for the purpose of scaring the other party, the professor and his son, together with one other of their party, were armed, the former with a double-barreled shotgun, and the two latter with, we believe, carbines. While in the act of loading, Moore and another man came up to them and told them to desist, and the latter got on one of the loads and commenced to pitch it off. And while in the act, the professor hit him on the head with his gun. The accounts of what transpired after this are somewhat conflicting, but it evidently appears that some high words ensued between Hodge and Moore while they were standing close together, and that the former pointed his gun at the breast of the latter, who shoved it away, saying as he retreated some distance, "Don't shoot me." But a minute or two transpired after this when they both fired simultaneously at each other, with almost fatal effect. The professor being wounded in the center of the breast, and Moore having 6 large buckshot in a semicircle from an inch to half an inch apart, around the region of his heart. It must have been at this juncture that Russell Hodge, the son, participated in the proceedings in defense of his father, for almost immediately after there were 2 more shots fired, one by young Hodge and the other by Moore, both likewise taking effect, the ball from the former's carbine lodging in Moore's groin, while the ball from the latter's revolver shattered Russell's wrist fearfully. The wounded men were taken to their respective cabins, which are but a short distance from each other. And this all sounds very similar to the Cave Gulch affair. Let's see, where are we here? Okay, and surgical aid was summoned and immediately from the city. Go down to the end here, the paper comments. It is useless for us to speculate on this matter or attempt to enter into an argument of the cause which led thereto. We have but given the bare facts in the case, leaving it for the proper courts to decide who was in the wrong, with the strong conviction that 2 of them may never appear before an earthly judge, and the trial of their cause will take place before that dread tribunal from which there is no appeal. Now, it turns out that George Moore died of his wounds. He was wounded twice. And Professor Hodge was feared to be quickly dying, mortally wounded, but he did actually recover. And his son, Russell, had to have his arm amputated at the elbow because his wrist was just shattered. So the Hodges recovered, and there was quite a trial. It was probably the most celebrated trial in early Territorial Montana at the time. It was held in Virginia City, and Hodge was acquitted. And Professor Hodge was acquitted, and his son was not charged either. So they had a party that night, and Professor Hodge and his wife quickly left the territory. But Russell Hodge did stay around, apparently, to kind of manage the affairs of the mining company. So these stories of this particular very brief period of time, a couple-month period in 1866, 67, kind of give us a window into one of the most violent times in Montana Territory, besides the vigilante business, which is also had been going on since 1863. So we see patterns, of course. Also happening very closely on the heels of this, some of you may know of, John Bozeman was murdered by parties who we don't know exactly. At the time, it was said that it was 4 or 5 Sioux Indians, or so we don't, or Blackfeet, I'm not sure. And then there recently has been, well, not recently, but there was always a story that his partner, Thomas Cover, who was with him at the time, possibly killed him for various reasons. Also, then we have Thomas Francis Meagher death, which you assume is probably an accident, but others have speculated, and there were stories that surfaced of plots to kill him. So these things happened in this April, and then the summer. Meagher died in July '67 as well. So all this is getting us into the violent times of Montana Territory. So why, going back to this question, why even look at this? Why do we need to study homicide in early Montana? I'm trying to understand kind of the territorial frontier society, and that's kind of where I'm coming from with this. I didn't really have I was sort of lured into this topic, so to say, and partly by vigilante violence and trying to understand that and putting it into context of what was this experience like for the people that lived here, for the miners, for your average everyday miner, or perhaps a farmer who came into different parts of the territory. What did they experience? How were they affected by this kind of violence? Also, we have the pretty well studied conflicts between Indian and whites in Montana and in the territory, and how does that come into play here? Is that a factor at all in vigilante justice taking place, or any of the other gunfights over just trivial things, and gunfights over very serious property issues, perhaps? Is there a relationship? I don't know. And also looking at the early territorial Montana is male dominated. It's 80 to 90% male in most of the camps. So violence is pretty much, especially lethal violence, is attached to male in a very, very large way. And I guess I sort of knew that already, but once I was studying homicide in the United States as a whole, the rates of male homicide is just hugely over anything that women experience. So what's going on there, and is that maybe the primary cause of this? I don't know. I wanted to find out what's the connection there. Then adding context to the whole the history of vigilantism. It's very popular, but I wanted to kind of break through that, the initial look at vigilantism, and try to put it in its context. Kind of practical considerations in studying this. It's easier to quantify a murder or a shootout where somebody dies, or some kind of homicide. It's going to show up in the newspaper. Sometimes there are local records and like coroner's inquests and so on. So these things are easier to quantify 150 years after the fact. Also, we have newspaper digitization, which is now we have quite a few newspapers available to browse through and look at, and even do some word searching. So I don't think I would even want to attempt this study without being able to do word searches for things like murder, shooting, all these different terms that I could put in and just do a quick search and then browse through those results. And I kind of wanted to test that to see how that would work. And I'll have some comments on that near the end here too. Okay, so my gateway drug to getting into this was the whole issue of violence in the American West, and kind of reading the sources that are out there, the history books that have been written in the last 20, 30 years, kind of drew me in, and then really snowballed into, this is something that I could really do. There's kind of a battle going on. There has been for maybe 15, 20 years between a couple guys, Robert Dykstra, and him taking on maybe new Western historians, or at least newer historians, younger historians, a different generation. Robert Dykstra wrote the classic Cattle Towns book, where he studied 5 Kansas cattle towns, and he talks about the violence that took place there. And his idea is that it really wasn't that much violence. It's very overblown, that violence in the American West is whipped up by all the mythology surrounded by the Old West and Western movies. So he's always been, since he wrote this book in the 60s, he's been on that, hitting that claim, saying, it wasn't as violent as it's made out to be. But from the 1990s and on following, partly because of the new Western history, more social historians wanted to study. Claire McCanna is one from California. did a major study of, what he did was a case study of 3 counties in different parts of the American West. And he chose Gila County, Arizona, Los Animas County, Colorado, kind of south central Colorado, and Douglas County, which is Omaha, Nebraska. And he studied these pretty detailed, went into coroner's inquest records primarily, and then supplemented by newspaper accounts and death registers, any other kind of local records, criminal cases, of course, and compiled a lot of data about these places from 1880 to 1920. And he came up with a conclusion that these areas were extremely violent, and that lethal violence, in particular homicide, was very prevalent in these places, especially Gila County and Arizona and Colorado County that he studied. The Omaha County was very interesting because there's a population of African Americans that mostly came from the South, and a lot of violence is tied to Southern roots, and so that was another aspect of it. But for Montana's case, his looking at Arizona and Colorado is a little more similar to our circumstances. So he's always interested, McKenna is interested in race and how race and these homicides intertwine, and whether or not justice is actually served, whether or not there's discrimination against perhaps Indians who commit homicide, or is there more Indians being killed in these kind of things. Also along the lines of Hispanics in both Colorado and Arizona in his study. So he's rather interested in race as it intersects the topic here. And it's very interesting. His work is very detailed and very statistical. He's gathering data and presenting it. And so you see a lot of influence from him on what I'm doing. Randolph Roth is kind of another big name or a big person. He wrote American Homicide, which is a very thick 600-page tome. 2009, he came out with that, and that covers the topic extremely well. And his main point, he has several different reasons for homicide to go up or down that he had in studying different regions in the United States. But the most interesting thing is that he ties it to a population's sense of stability in government or trust in government, and that's the thing that I think comes to play here in Montana Territory. And so I borrow a lot of what he's looking at there. He presents it as it's a hypothesis. It's something that needs testing, and that certainly influenced me in wanting to come up with this study to say, let's look at early territorial Montana, which really doesn't have a very good government at the beginning, and is developing government and the justice system over those couple decades. And let's see if homicide is high when government is not very well established, and decreases, and how that correlates. So that's a lot of his influence on me there. Robert Dykstra and Randolph Roth have really gone at it in the last decade or so. Since 2003, they've had 4 different articles back and forth in a couple journals, historical journals, and it's interesting to read. There's a lot of back and forth. I really feel that Roth has proven his case that what Dykstra likes to do is kind of undermine the statistics and say, well, you're studying very small areas, and so your conclusions are not necessarily going to be as solid as they would be if you had a larger population to study. And there's something to that, but I think he takes it much too far and discounts any validity in the studying smaller populations like we have in Montana Territory. And Roth defends this kind of the statistical position of that you can do this. There are statistical methods that can give you a certainty, a percentage of validity to your results, and if you study a small population over a longer period of time, your accuracy is going to be much better. So that's kind of where that debate comes down. I'm pretty sure that I appreciate Dykstra's challenge, but I really side with the folks on the other side that are trying to compile the data and information on how many homicides took place, what kinds were they, and this is a very high rate of homicide in these areas. And I'll show you first let's get into just a brief definition. Homicide in this is any killing of one human being by another that cannot be clearly identified as accidental. So an accidental death in a mine or in whatever circumstances, if a gun goes off, that's not a homicide. If it's an accident, if it's clearly identified as an accident. But any other killing is going to be counted as a homicide, even if it's a negligent homicide situation, which there's a couple that I found that I did include in calculating the results here. So murder is, it's much more limited term that generally is going to be dealt with in legal terms of whether you're convicted of first or second degree murder in a court. So we talk about, this isn't really a study of murder necessarily, because that's probably a little more limited. There's much more homicide taking place than actual murder. Would you say that vigilantes killing a thief for whatever crime is a murder? I wouldn't say it's a murder necessarily. It's a homicide. They're killing him, but they have clear reasons, and it's a different process. So it's kind of technical maybe, but homicide is a thing I think to study, and what just want to make that clarification. So when you calculate homicide rates in a particular location, it's a mathematical thing. You try to estimate the number of homicides. So you're going through and trying to count them up. And you divide that by the estimated annual population of adults. And we're only talking about adults here because if you try to count children, if you're trying to compare a place like Montana Territory where there really aren't that many children to somewhere back east, your rates are going to be different. They're going to be affected by the difference in the number of children. So you really only want to count adults. So you have to average out an annual population in an area for the adult population. So it's the estimated homicides divided by the annual population. And then you multiply that by 100,000, and that's the kind of the FBI statistical standard among sociologists and historians, anybody who's kind of studying homicide and reporting on a number of homicides. Like FBI statistics come out every year for places all throughout the United States, and they do it in this fashion. They talk about the number of homicides per 100,000 population. So that's kind of the standard. So I want to introduce you to that. A high rate of homicide is considered about nine people per 100,000 killed. Extremely high rate would be 35, in the neighborhood of 35 people per 100,000 and higher. So kind of get that number lodged in. 9 is high, and that's generally what the United States is at. We're about 9 to 10 right now for like the past 20, 30 years, and even most of the 20th century. We've had a pretty high rate. And so a modern example, pulling this from, I think, Randolph-Roth, Miami-Dade County was the number one homicide capital of the United States in 1980, 35.3 per 100,000. And the United States as a whole that year was 10.7. So, all right, so the initial plan on doing this research was to select a couple counties for a case study. And that's kind of this initial thing that I'm reporting on. This is kind of preliminary. This is a larger project that I want to keep doing, keep gathering more information and data on. Lewis and Clark County and Gallatin County are the ones I chose. Lewis and Clark is very characteristic of an urban mining area, of course, at the time. Gallatin County is much more characteristic of an agricultural, ranching, farming area, probably the number one farming area in the early territory, and then growing into really the agricultural center for the territory in the early statehood. But it also has the urban supply center of Bozeman, so it's an interesting place to look at too. It gives us a diversity of characteristic places in Montana to look at. And so, no Virginia City, sorry. I wanted to avoid the vigilante thing, the center of vigilantism in Virginia City. in these early years, so I just pushed it to the side and say, okay, somebody else can look at that. And there have been other books. Alan's great book on decent orderly lynching is very good. Not really statistical in its approach, but very good in covering the details. He's a very good researcher and storyteller. Okay, so the sources I used here for Edgerton, which was Lewis and Clark County at the very beginning, the first few years, and then becomes Lewis and Clark with an E until about 1901 or something, when they figured out that Clark was spelled with no E. And you see it on all the records, Clark with an E. Coroner's inquests actually exist in Lewis and Clark County, and the only county that I've found in Montana with coroner's inquests so far. I haven't checked every single county, but I've checked Madison, Gallatin, Marr, I don't think they have any, and Lewis and Clark. And Jefferson doesn't have any. So these don't exist in general, unfortunately, because coroner's inquests are the best for trying to track, because anytime a body shows up, there's a dead body is produced by whatever event, a coroner's inquest is impaneled, and they give a thorough investigation as to why this person died and give you facts and details about the person. So they're wonderful records. We happen to have them for Lewis and Clark, which was great. I didn't have to travel far at all for that. Unfortunately, they're not really complete. When you look at them, they microfilm them out of order. They include some of Choteau County, early Choteau County from the 1870s. There's about at least 5 or 6 coroner's inquest documents in there from Choteau County. I don't know how those exactly ended up in Lewis and Clark counties, but they did. And then there's just a lot missing. There's some years where there's none. And when you get into the 1880s, it's starting to be, you can see it's a lot better. The coroner's inquests were a lot more thorough. They're doing a better job of accounting for these. So that's what you'll see. I've really focused on the 1880s for those records. I used the newspapers, and I used primarily the Montana Post. It is completely digitized, the whole run of it, from 1864 up to 1870, I believe. So I haven't completed going through all that. I've gotten to, I think, 1868. So still have more to go looking through the Post. Gallatin County only used the Post, which could cause some undercounting perhaps. Okay, so progress report. These are the years that we're going to look at real quick here. For Edgerton County, I got a snapshot at the beginning, 1865 to 1867, and then again with those coroner's inquests looking at 1883 to 1889. So that's right up to the end of the territorial period, because we become a state in 1889. Gallatin County, I just have that first period looking at the Montana Post. So I have collected data for other counties as I've been going through the Montana Post, so I have quite a bit collected. I don't think it's in a state where I really want to present it, and I'm kind of trying, this whole process of coming up with this study is trying to figure out what's the best way to, does it work to just look at counties, or do I need to look at kind of choose a region? How does that affect the results and stuff? And so we'll see that coming out when I'm showing you with the results. So I have some up through the 1870s and 1880s as well. But what I really want to do ultimately then is, after the data is kind of finally collected, then to go back and try to put together something that would be published, like an article or whatever, that would have other newspaper accounts backing up the data and make it more kind of a fuller story, of course. So for Gallatin County, this is just a list of that period, 1864 to 1867. At the beginning, Gallatin County is not very heavily settled at all for several years. And so you have conflicts between early settlers and Indians coming up. That's what the first several are. There's a band of Sioux that come in a raid in 1865, and they kill a couple people at a couple different locations. They have some shootouts with locals who are actually doing some work on a ranch, and the Sioux just come upon them. So these aren't really, I don't count them as a kind of a warfare thing where you would say, well, it's war, people are going to kill each other. This is a raid. The Sioux are coming in to kind of show their presence, perhaps, and they come in contact with some ranchers, and they end up killing some people. So The other ones, and this happens in Bannock as well early on, where settlers just end up shooting Indians because they're afraid of them for various reasons, for reasons that we would be shocked at, I'm sure. But people just shot at Indians and killed them, and that's what those two cases are in the Post. They were actually shot for their horses, apparently. So we have vigilantes, obviously. Vigilantes are not only working and active in Madison, and they actually are traveling along and coming into different areas. Local citizens are part of the vigilante movement. So it really is more of a movement. It's affecting every county in Montana, really. So several cases come up of stringing guys up who had probably were thieves. Anyway. So, in the very bottom there was Mr. Stately, who was mentioned earlier near Willow Creek. And we have John Bozeman in here. Gallatin County went all the way over to where Livingston, to Park County is today and beyond. And then in 1867, Governor Marr ends up, calls up troops finally. And so troops are trying to find Indians somewhere in this area around the Yellowstone River at the time, and they don't find any really at all. But the troops get into trouble. There's fights, there's a stabbing incident, there's a classic Old West shootout between a captain and a younger soldier, where they're like near at the stable and they're shooting at each other, 3-4 shots, and they miss with every shot. Finding the final shot, the captain hits the guy and he dies. That's C. Dunman, that case there, killed by Captain Hart in the classic shootout. Hatchet wound to the head. The case of J. Davidson was vicious, a vicious murder. 4 men came in and were never found, never caught. They thought that he had a large sum of cash because he had been seen in Virginia City by them, and he was followed back to Gallatin. He had been seen getting a bunch of money. He was going to head east to take it back home. And he was viciously killed by these men. His partner or friend who was staying with him actually got away, ran, and ended up eluding the guys. And those 4 men were never captured, never found by the vigilantes. There's another shooting of Elk Morris at Morris's store in Gallatin Valley. Another shootout, deciding something with guns. So here's kind of the run. 3 homicides in 1864, down pretty typical range each year. It comes to averaging out the population of the area, and these are really estimates of the population because we don't have any good counts. The homicide rate comes to 400 for the whole period of those 4 years, roughly 4 years. It's 400 per 100,000. So 35 is extremely high. 400 is astronomically high. It's off the charts, and so this is one of those cases there. Another, Randolph Roth did a quick count of murder cases around Bannock in 1862 to 63, and he came up with a figure of like 1,200 per 100,000 for early Bannock. There was a lot of killings, a lot of people were dying. So that comes out to the risk of homicide for somebody is 1 in 250. The case of early Bannock was 1 in 50 were being killed during that 18-month period in Bannock. So this is 4 years in Gallatin. It's a very high rate of killing. And if you didn't count 1 or 2 of these cases, the number would go down a good amount, but still be very high. So, it's no matter, even if you dropped a couple of these cases and said, well, they're really not homicides, the count would still be very high. So people have looked at it and go, well, did people really, when they settled in Gallatin Valley in this time, did they feel that it was a very violent place? Maybe they didn't. I mean, they're coming from the Civil War. So maybe they just expected it to be a place where you could lose your life at any time. If you were a particular type of person, if you were trying to steal horses and cattle, you were probably going to die. It's not a good place to try to steal horses and cattle. So this just gets at, trying to calculate the risk of homicide at this period. And so we look at Edgerton County, the list. Kind of going to run out of time, so let's move along. But A lot there's 11 cases of homicide in 1865, the first year for Helena, for Edgerton County. Most of these are vigilante hangings. So vigilantes are incredibly active 1865 in Helena. And this is all very well documented in Allen's book, Decent Orderly Lynching. As you get into 1866, much less cases of it, and probably for good reason, because the vigilantes were active. There are a few vigilante hangings. James Daniels, a very notable one, which we have the photograph of him. There's that Lewis truck was possible suicide there, gunshot wound to the head. Some others that were shootouts up in Sun River. John Peterson died. One case I want to read you the account of. There it is Samuel Hayes. This is Samuel Hayes. You see there, September. Within that 1 week, Samuel Hayes is African American. He's killed in a barber shop in Helena. And just a few days later, a Chinese woman is killed. And we really don't know the circumstances of that death. It's a killing. We really don't know who did it. There wasn't any other documentation about it. There's just a very brief mention in the newspaper. But Samuel Hayes' case is the only one that we have information, sort of a racially motivated killing. The particulars in the recent shooting affair, which resulted in the death of Samuel Hayes, as related to us by an eyewitness, are briefly these. Deceased had an altercation with George Washington, a barber, another African-American barber, growing out of some abusive language used by the deceased, which finally ended in a fight between the parties. This is not where the homicide comes from. This is just what starts the situation. These two men are fighting. During the struggle, the crowd rushed in and interfered, separating the participants. When someone in the crowd cried out, "Hang the nigger," and excuse the language, but "hang the nigger," which was immediately answered by the crowd making a rush for them. One of them was secured and marched off in the direction of Judge McCarthy's office. He, however, managed to effect his escape before proceeding many steps and ran off home. The deceased, not being so fortunate, was detained by the crowd, and while held by them, was accosted by the man John Leach in the following manner: "You black son of a b, you drew a pistol on a white man, did you?" "I did not," was the answer. "You lie if you say so." "Do you call me a liar?" said Leach. "Yes," was the instant retort. "Or anybody else that says I drew a pistol or carry one." Deceased then walked off, going down Main Street until he reached the Crystal Palace barber shop, which he entered. He had not been there many minutes before Leach approached him and collared him with one hand, and with the other drew from his coat pocket a pistol, and cocking it, placed the muzzle within a few inches of the head of his intended victim, repeating his former remark, "You drew a pistol upon a white man, did you?" Deceased answered that he did not, and threw up his hands, telling him to search him if he thought he had any weapons, remarking at the same time to Leach, "My fuss was with a colored man and not with you. I don't want anything to do with you." At the same time, stepping back from him, which Leach perceiving, leveled his pistol and pointing it at the deceased said, "If you open your mouth again, I will kill you," and instantly fired, the ball entering the left side below the breast. Hayes lived about half an hour after being shot. So, sad case, but that is the only racially motivated homicide found in these first few years. So moving on. Okay, Edgerton County, summarized there, comes out less homicidal than Gallatin County. There's a larger population, and there's a little, people are more intensely involved in mining and probably more active in doing that, and the downtime is when the homicides probably take place, besides perhaps any shootings over property, which there are only a few really in the early period. So that comes to about 154.5 people per 100,000. It's 1 in 647 during these few years. So it's a pretty high homicide rate, not as high as Gallatin. So getting into the 1880s, we see much less homicide in the 1880s. And a larger population in Helena and surrounding areas in Lewis and Clark County. You see almost very little vigilante activity, really none, specifically vigilante. There is some mob lynching of Con Murphy, who was a notorious outlaw who was captured and hung by a mob in 1885 out in the valley. There's a couple shooting's. There's one that actually takes place in Avon, just across the border, which I actually counted in this case, and I'm still not sure I should count it, but a criminal was being chased by an escapee, was being chased by the sheriff, and the sheriff shot him when he confronted him on a train at the Avon station. There's some other cases, negligent homicide occurring with fires happening in a lodging house, laudanum being given to someone, too much and very deadly laudanum in this case was given to somebody, where the coroner's inquest found the people to be negligently involved. So a stab wound. Right here, Phoebe Mitchell Rand in 1888 was killed by her husband, Napoleon Rand, and then he shot himself. So this is the first murder-suicide that occurs. And this is the first woman, actually second woman, because the Chinese woman was killed in 1860s. But the first woman I'm counting here in the 1880s, the only one. A couple Chinese are involved in homicides, 1888 and 89. So there very much is a population still, and one is a wound from a cleaver. Often Chinese are not going to be as much involved in gun violence, more knives and so on, but one of the cases is a shooting over a mining claim. Okay, so summarizing that, we see a much lower homicide rate, 18.2 per 100,000. So coming down from like 150 something per 100,000 down to 18.2 during this period. And you see each year's rate starting out extremely high, coming down into a range that is much more typical of a more settled area in the United States. So you really kind of see this happening. Even that one year, 1886. I haven't gone through the newspapers as well for that period, and I'd really like to do that because it's hard to believe there wasn't one homicide in that year. But there's only one that comes up in the coroner's inquest in 1889. So these numbers may change with more research in the newspapers. You may find more things happening, but still the homicide rate is much lower. The risk of homicide, one in over 5,493. Much better odds that I would much rather have. So kind of summing up preliminary conclusions with all this, there hasn't been a lot of this kind of research in the American West, but where it has taken place, we have the cattle towns in Kansas that Dykstra has done, and the figures there are about 129 per 100,000 during the 70s and 80s. 116 per 100,000 in Bodie, California, which is a kind of a very rough mining town in California, eastern Sierra Nevada. And then the study in Gila County, Arizona, which had a very high rate of 156. So you kind of see where we're coming down. Gallatin County in the 1860s, 400, very high, even higher than Los Angeles, which in the early 1850s was a very deadly place. A lot of shootouts, a lot of shooting going on. Edgerton County is a little more reasonable, probably because it's a larger population and the vigilantes are so active and so it's very well known that the vigilantes are there and actively stringing up thieves and other folks. So frontier lethal violence is very intense in Montana. That's a definite conclusion from this. Late 1880s, lethal violence is dramatically lower. I don't know why exactly, but I think it has something to do with the government becoming more stable, people becoming, I buy into that idea. I think it's very hard to prove it besides pointing out that, different places where people would show trust in government, or that you can show that there is more stability in government happening. So I think it's a tough thing to show, but there's other things that you might think of, like a person's race or class or where they're from or whatever. They don't correlate as directly as this idea of looking at people's trust in government and the stability of government. The murder rates very closely correspond to that, so there's a definite connection. It's just a difficult thing to really grasp clearly. So isolating counties, I think, is not optimum. I have the case of the cave gulch stuff going on right out over in Marr County. It's all part of this area of Helena and down to Gallatin, and trying to, you have to kind of make a boundary somewhere. So counties are helpful because they often keep records, or they have a newspaper that covers a county. But I really need to kind of go beyond those borders, I think, in putting this study together. So I'm going to try to do that. Suicides they require the attention of somebody. There are a lot of cases of suicide. There's a good number of, in the coroner's inquest, there was a good number of also accidental deaths or deaths in mining accidents as well, which was certainly interesting to look at, why that was happening and whatever. But suicides are, there's a lot of suicide going on. And, modern day Montana has a problem with suicide as well. So something that I think would be really worth looking at. What are the beginnings of this happening? Why is it related to the mining rushes, and the downside of the rush where people are struggling, not making it. So suicide is something that happens in this environment. I wanted to end with more of a human note. So conclusion here. I have a letter that was written to the editor of the Montana Post, 1867, and it was concerning the murder of Frank Lovejoy in Beartown, Montana Territory. This is the letter. Editor Post, Dear Sir, in your valuable paper of the 5th instant, I noticed an account of the murder of F.S. Lovejoy at Beartown, Montana Territory. Nothing has occurred of late that has given me more pain than the receipt of the intelligence of the death of poor Lovejoy and the brutal manner in which it was brought about. The deceased was an old and valued friend of mine, I having formed his acquaintance in the summer of '61 in the state of Nevada, and having in the winter of '63, whilst prostrated by illness and unable to assist myself, received from him all the delicate care and attention of a devoted brother, more appreciable from the fact that it was pure and disinterested, the offspring of a noble and generous heart. He was a young man of unexceptionable habits and endowed by nature with more than ordinary intellect. He was a native of New Hampshire, and no son of the Granite State has ever fallen upon this coast who has carried with him to his grave a purer fame and more grateful remembrance than the deceased. He leaves no better man behind. Green be the sod above thee, friend of my helpless days. W.H.H. Thatcher, Leesburg, Idaho Territory. I'll leave it right there. Thank you. And if anybody has questions, I'd be glad to discuss things. Yeah.